Now, we're all familiar with nonsense elitism, right? You know, like the hipsters who refuse to listen to Taylor Swift music, even though it's great, or the jazz fans who try to get you to listen to songs that are 20 minutes long. I'm sorry, no one wants to listen to Miles Davis anymore. I mean, I do, but no one else does, alright? Like, can y'all stop being annoying? You're making us look bad. Or alternatively, the hyperpop stans who try to get you to listen to a song with air horns in it in the year 2021. That's me. But today, I want to talk about gamers instead. Okay, well, I want to talk about social identity theory. Actually, I want to talk about philosophy. God, I don't know. It's going to go a lot of directions, all right? So, let me set the stage for you. Let's say, like you're a student, right? And the entirety of what's motivating you is like being a good student. And you find a lot of self-worth through being a good student. And a lot of your life centers around that. And then you graduate high school, and then you don't end up going to college. Maybe you don't have money for it. Maybe you're not that interested. And you find you don't know what to do anymore because you aren't a student anymore. A student's a thing of the past. What do you do when your identity is in crisis? How do you get out of that? How do you reconceptualize what's going on in order to get back that sense of self-esteem that you were getting from your previous identity? Lightweight stuff for a nice evening. So pour a glass of unspecified non-alcoholic beverage and let's get started with this. I hate to say it, but we do have to start with the nerd stuff in order to get to the stuff about gamers. Oh god, it's all nerd stuff, isn't it? So a group in sociology is basically just any collection of people who share entitivity. Entitivity is just believing you're part of the group. Let's give a pretty simple example. So let's say I'm a scientist and I'm going into a room and I'm like, all right, I'm going to do a study about people who have pens in their pockets versus those who don't have pens in their pockets. So if one group of people could go into the pen in their pocket corner and the other group of people goes into the pens not in their pocket corner. Now, I just made these groups up. Like, these groups are not real until anyone says they're a part of them. However, if people start dividing in the room, and they believe they're entative in that group, entitives, yeah, I brought it back. Anyways, if people believe they're a part of the group and then organize based off of it, then congrats, they're a group now. As you can kind of tell, a group is very mushy. Groups can be kind of just basically anything. So long as you believe you're a part of it, and there are other people who also believe they're a part of it, it's a group. And that's basically the basics of it. There are also in-groups, which are just groups you believe you're a part of, and out-groups, groups that you do not believe you're a part of. I'm going to be focusing about Henry Tatchville's social identity theory and a little bit of the stuff that came after it. Obviously, there are a bunch of identity theories, and there are a bunch of sociological theories about group behavior, and if you want to check those out, that's great. I'm just going to focus on this one, though, because I don't have time, and my professor would murder me right now if I tried to do that. So, we're just sticking to one. Henry Tatchville was a Polish sociologist, and he was very interested in studying how groups worked. Him and his cohorts, including Michael Billig, that name will be important later, decide to do a bunch of tests on some of their students at first, and then more groups of people later on, to look at how in-group bias works. This was after World War II, so it was kind of, to put it gently, people were pretty interested in why some people don't like each other, and how people can justify that dislike with groups. The test was done like so. Every student would participate in this test, and there would be a bunch of dots on the screen, and they'd appear for a little bit, and then they'd disappear entirely. Every student would then make a guess about how many dots were on the screen, and then they'd write it down. The dots were like way too many to count, so there was no way they were going to figure it out correctly. They would do a bunch of these tests, and then one half of the students were told, "Hello there. All right, so here's the deal. There are two types. You're going to be either an overestimator or an underestimator. You're both like the overestimators and the underestimators are both just about as accurate as each other, but you're going to be in one of the two categories." The other group was told that, all right, so here's the deal. There are two categories. There are people who got closer to the answer, and there are people who got farther away from the answer, and you're going to be divided based on that instead. Nobody knew what other people's identifications are. After the tests, they were like, hey, we already have you here, so we're going to do some other research as well. And they were all put in individual places to do the surveys alone, just like, just a closed room. I'm sure this was very awkward for the students, but we're going to ignore that for now. As far as studies go, this isn't the worst one. So we're going to, it's awkward. It would definitely be awkward, but it's not horrible, all right? So the students were put in rooms alone, and they were given a bunch of values. And then the researchers said, all right, so here's the deal. The values represent some small sum of money. you have to distribute the limited number of values to the other students. And you weren't told anything about the other students except what group they were a part of. And even with the group that was told that they were just overestimators and underestimators, they still exhibited in-group bias on a pretty consistent basis. The groups that were told they were more correct, of course, actually showed in-group bias a lot more. As it turns out, a value judgment does kind of accentuate some of the problems that are happening. And they repeated this experiment in different ways with different people, and they basically just found it to be pretty consistent. When people were assigned to a group, even if that group was based off of some completely arbitrary category for no reason, they still showed in-group favoritism. Henry Tadfeld basically put together social identity theory as a way to explain this. There were 3 main tenets. 1. People want to have a positive social identity. Obviously, your social identity is made up of a variety of things. It might be the stuff you do, and for this case, it might also be your group memberships, what groups you're a part of, which a group membership that is a part of yourself could be called a social identity, right? It's an identity you take in a social context and is socially understood by other people. 2, social identity is in part based off of favorable comparison to other outgroups, right? So like if you want your social identity to be positive, you want in some way your social identity to be more like good in some ways that other groups are not good. It doesn't have to be looking down on the other groups, but you do want to have some positive differentiation, generally speaking. 3, if a person's identity isn't positively influenced by their social identity, either they're going to look to change the group from within, or they're going to look to leave the group entirely. There's a few more things that go along with this as well. So, obviously, since social identities are based on groups, and groups are very kind of fuzzy, there are a few things that it's going to inherit from groups as a whole. So, for example, if a group isn't salient, if a social identity isn't salient in a certain situation, it's not going to happen. Like, outside of that room with the overestimators and the underestimators, those students aren't going to remember those categories. Those categories didn't matter. All that mattered was that in that context, the fact that they were a part of those groups was made obvious. The second half of this is that a social identity is going to have a lot more influence if it's a bigger part of someone's self-identity, if it's a bigger part of someone's total estimation of their own personality and stuff about them. You know, like if, for me, for example, I work at a restaurant. Me working at a restaurant is not a very important part of my identity. So I'm not going to look to embody the values of other people who identify as restaurant workers, and I'm not really going to be looking to brag about that to my friends. So that group's not going to be salient in very many situations. If being an overestimator, or being an underestimator, or being more correct at the dot choice, or being a man isn't a very important part of someone's personality, then it's not going to motivate behavior very much now, is it? Why are you looking at me like that? This is an example. It's just an example, okay? A lot of research came from Henry Tadfeld's studies, and a kind of expansion of those ideas was self-categorization theory. It focused a little more on intergroup, so stuff that was inside of a group conflict, whereas the categorization theory, or the original social identity theory, had a lot more to do with outgroups and how you viewed them. This further research in social categorization theory basically looked at how prototypes work and how people look to aspire to be a certain prototype. A prototype is just the ideal sort of person that's constructed based off of a social identity and the social identity's values. So if some groups are going to have more of a prototype, some will have less of a prototype. A lot of times prototypes will be based off of like the leaders of a group, or leaders is in quotation marks here because it's just people who maybe all the group people kind of agree with, or everyone with a certain identity is going to be like, all right, yeah, I think this person exemplifies the values that we share and the things that we share that make us part of the same group. A good example of a prototype actually would be Jesus in Christianity. The entire point of Jesus is for people to have someone to model their behavior after. Jesus is essentially the perfect role model, and that's kind of a pretty core tenet of Christianity to some people. I know there's infighting about this, but that's a whole other topic. But my point is that the prototype is an example for other people to follow. Identity is a kind of a funny thing, isn't it? I've used the word identity a lot, so I'm gonna go ahead and define a few of these meanings of identity, and I'm gonna steal this all from John Edwards' book on language and identity language and identities in Introduction. So we all have a sort of self-identity, And that's basically our idea of ourself, right? It's like our personality, you know, everything we associate with ourselves, what we want other people to see. Some people draw a distinction between our self-concept, which is our unfiltered version of ourselves, and our self-identity, which is the filtered version we want other people to see. It doesn't matter too much to discuss the differences between those two here, though. Your self-identity is just your idea of all of your own traits. A social identity, on the other hand, is a group membership. A social identity is when you take some group that you've categorized yourself in, and it becomes sort of a sector of your personality. It becomes part of yourself. The more you engage with that group, the more that group's identity matters to you, and the more it becomes salient in different situations, the more it's going to influence your own values as well, and your own behaviors as well, and the more it becomes a part of your self-identity. Again, I'm not going to be using self-identity too much because I know it's confusing. I'm gonna stay away from it for the most part, though. So let's do a little recap. Social identity theory said, "Heyo, in-group bias. It exists. Maybe that's a problem. It even exists when the groups don't actually matter very much. We see it. Maybe it's a defense mechanism. Who knows? But it happens." Second, people who want to be part of a group will generally try to embody a sort of prototype, an ideal, a set of attributes that creates essentially the ideal member of the group. Sometimes prototypes are based off of specific people. Sometimes prototypes are just a collection of traits that people kind of just throw around, you know, or maybe it's even a meme. Hint, hint. That'll be important later. Okay. Now it's time for the gamer stuff. Hello there, college professors, my fellow students, and possibly even my future employer. This is the part where we talk about video games. So, what is a gamer? What makes a gamer? Who are the gamers? So, in order for a group to exist, you have to declare it to be, and there has to be people who believe they're a part of it, right? So if no one believes they're a part of a group, obviously it doesn't exist. What happened with gamers especially is that people would call themselves gamers, you know, and some people would mean capital G gamer, as in people who play lots of video games. Maybe they have thousands of hours in Halo. Maybe they have thousands of hours in Heroes of the Storm. Maybe they have both. Who knows? But they play a whole lot of video games. And lowercase g gamers, what some people would call casual gamers. And for women, usually they're just called fake gamers. That would be me. I'm going to be using the word gamer a lot because it's basically unavoidable. When I say gamers, I'm obviously generalizing. This doesn't apply to every single individual gamer. I'm referring to a common set of values, a common set of beliefs that were held by certain people in a certain period, particularly from like the 2000s to the 2010s. Cool? Cool. What happened over time was that as gamers started to further define what a real gamer was versus a fake gamer, now, if you add a bunch of attributes, like you say, oh, you have to play certain types of games, you know, some people aren't real gamers, there are multiple types of gamers, some of them are better than others. What happens over time is that the average person's definition of a gamer, which is just someone who plays video games, and the internal definition of gamer, as set by gamers, in this case, young white men, is very different. Like, there's gonna be a pretty considerable gap between them. Because when they say gamers, they mean like them. They mean people who look like them, they mean people who act like them, they mean people who play the types of games that they play. And then other people just don't have the same opinion. And see, the thing is, as reasonable as it is to want to have a sort of like, a term for like hardcore gamers or like people who spend a lot of their free time doing it, like hobbyist gamers, I guess you could say, the way these borders were set was not around how much someone played video games, because some people, say young white men, if they said they were a gamer, you just believe them. But if women said they were a gamer, the interviewer would ask them to show their World of Warcraft hours, or people would assume that, oh, this woman doesn't actually run this cosplay booth, it's just someone they brought in to look pretty. There's a general air of deception around women in games. In her book about gaming masculinity, Megan Condis essentially lays out the three archetypes of the gamer girl. There is the sidekick gamer girl. She's a real gamer. She's a real certified gamer. She plays video games, but of course is not as good as the gamer boy in this situation at video games. She always plays player two. They play together in games. It's never competitive, or if it is competitive, he's still better at it. This is like the ideal gamer girl, so she's also tends to be very down to earth, and she tends to not wear very much makeup, and she tends not to pretty herself up very much, none of which are bad things, but it's weird that they're associated with goodness. Put a pin in that one. The second kind of gamer girl is the casual gamer girl, right? So she's gonna look like, just an average lady. She doesn't really have as much of a consistent appearance. And she plays like The Sims and stuff, and she's considered like a gamer, but it's fine as long as she's honest about it. Like she doesn't, she admits that she's a casual gamer. She doesn't claim like she's a hardcore gamer. The most conniving of the gamer girls is the fake gamer girl, who's prettied herself up for the camera, who puts on the anime girl cat ears and the hair and the choker and the Mario Bros t-shirt, all to get the attention of gamer boys for whatever reason. The gamer girl is inherently dishonest. She pretends to be a gamer in order to get male attention because she's just so desperate for attention that she's willing to pretend she's a nerd in order to do it. Good gamer girls are ones who are down to earth and don't worry very much about their appearances and aren't looking for attention. Bad gamer girls are the ones who lie and say they're gamers even though they're not gamers. Of course, a big problem with this, is that you have to make gamers very specific now, because the fake gamer girl only exists if you try to say that being a gamer is a lot more than just playing any amount of video games, because most people fall into that category. And so they craft this narrative of people who lie about like the hardcoreness of their gaming or whatever in order to get attention. And the thing is, a lot of people who were labeled fake gamer girls in real life were not a fake gamer girl. Many women in games journalism and game development commonly have themselves subject to a lot more scrutiny when it comes to whether or not they actually play video games very much. Women at conventions who run booths sometimes get called booth babes because of a general idea that, oh, they just put the pretty lady out in front so that more people would come by, but she's not actually a real cosplayer, or she's not actually a real nerd, or she's not actually a real gamer. If I had to guess, I'd say it's a cope. Like, they look at these women who are beautiful and have the same hobbies as them, and they can't have them, so they craft this idea that, oh, well, actually, just these super pretty women are just fakers. Like, they're not real gamers, they're not real nerds. So I can dislike them anyways. It's envy. They envy their position and their ability to get other people's attention and to be able to date people, but they can't reach that themselves. So to cope with that, they say that they're bad, or they say that they're being shallow, and however many other horrible things all get like associated together in this one big bad lump of misogyny. So remember that the main tenet of Henry Tajfel's theory is the idea that everyone wants to maintain a positive self-image, and one of the best ways to do that is to have a positive idea of the groups that you're a part of. However, this can cause some issues. Tajfel saw the act of categorizing people, the act of assigning people social identities, was directly tied to prejudice, that because we want our identity to be positive, and we want our identity to be positively differentiated from others, that act inherently leads to prejudice, that leads to bigotry. However, there's clearly a little more to it than that. Michael Billig, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, definitely agreed that there's a little more to prejudice than just positively differentiating a group. That can't just be inherently bad. So being a gamer pretty quickly became more than just playing video games, and the best way to look at how those borders were drawn is to look at Gamergate. If you've spent some time around video game YouTube, you're probably already a little familiar with this. Basically, many women, many of which were journalists, some of which were game developers, some of which were critics, were harassed and had their personal information leak. 2 of them had to move from their houses and just had the most horrible vitriol spewed at them for several years straight, all because of concerns about ethics in games journalism and just a variety of different reasons, all kind of centering around the idea that the stereotypical gamer as we know them is no longer a thing, that the prototype of a gamer as a young white man who loves video games and plays certain types of video games is gone entirely. Writers like Lee Alexander, Dan Golding, and Casey Johnston all wrote about how they believed the stereotype was dead. Anita Sarkeesian did a YouTube series about how there were bad tropes in video games, and many people were not a particularly big fan of a woman doing a very basic feminist critique of video games that literally it went as far as, it kind of sucks that Princess Peach is just always the damsel in distress. Like, this is such an old trope. How are we still doing this? The reality is, a lot of people were upset to find out that it wasn't just sad white boys who wanted to get out, who wanted a reason to escape from their crappy lives. LGBT people, women, people of color, immigrants, and a variety of other people all have reasons to want to escape their crappy lives. We all want to escape our crappy lives. That's the point of video games. That's why they're cool. An article by Andrea Braithwaite writes about the variety of ways which Gamergate sort of became apparent in the discourse. Quote, Geek masculinity is conditioned by practices that have historically equated technological access and prowess with masculinity, as well as popular perceptions that gaming is a guy thing. Yet at the same time, geeks and nerds also feel somewhat marginalized by other men, because geek and nerddom aren't really traditionally masculine things like maybe sports are, or being muscular. I don't know what's traditional masculinity, you would have to ask someone else. So Andrea Braithwaite expands upon this in her article, and she talks about how there are essentially three main themes in the various comments about Gamergate, and about ethics in games journalism, and about developers Zoe Quinn, Anita Sarkeesian, etc., etc. First, you have crusader imagery, disciplining unruly female voices, and claims that real, that is male, gamers are actually the real victims of Gamergate. Let's read some quotes. EVE Online PvP really does demonstrate just how formidable gamers can be as opponents, and how a common identity... Wait, hold on, I'm gonna do an accent. EVE Online PvP really does demonstrate just how formidable gamers can be as opponents, and how a common identity can really strengthen resolve. One man, Oliver Campbell, wrote this one. Right now in our industry, we have those who are trying to tear it apart for personal gain, and your customers are fighting to protect you. These same customers who gave you thunderous applause today have spent almost a year of their lives fighting to protect you. This one from a scholar talking about Gamergate. The 4chaners expressed their hatred and disgust towards her. They expressed their glee at the thought of ruining her career. This is all about Anita Sarkeesian, by the way. They fantasize about her being redacted and killed, and there was an ongoing discussion of her redacted, described variously as wide, large enough to fit 12 redacted at once, and a festering redacted that leaves a redacted. I can't read the rest of it, but it just goes on like that. It gets worse. I left out the worst bits. Hey Toots, this is bad. This is really bad. How did all this happen? One more quote. Yes, I may be an evil cisgendered white male. However, throughout my earlier life, I was the outsider, the person to, well, not outright shun, just not to be interacted with. It wasn't until, for the most part, I was able to get constant access to the internet, I was able to feel like I belong anywhere. Gaming/internet has let me belong, and not to feel so alone, and redacted these people for demonizing it, and me over and over and over again. Whew. Kind of a lie, isn't it? That's a lot to deal with. Let's dig into it. Tajfel's ideas about identity, while definitely getting into some ideas about intergroup processes and how identity kind of works, definitely aren't enough to have a comprehensive theory of prejudice, right? Just outgroup stereotyping and in-group bias isn't enough to generate the amount of harassment that happened here, and certainly isn't enough to generate the massive amounts of even worse prejudice that have existed in many societies throughout the world. Billig basically said that prejudice and bigotry have a very emotional aspect to them, and that this emotional aspect is cultivated by an ideology, by a narrative that's told about a group. In the case of the gamers, this narrative was about the SJWs. They created this idea of a war between the gamers who were trying to protect their beloved medium and the SJWs who were trying to ruin it. Of course, the SJWs didn't exist. The SJWs just describes a group that they created. No one actually believes they were an SJW. I mean, I'm sure some people believe they are SJWs, but at this point it's more in an ironic sense than anything, because people are aware of how it was just used as a label for people that, in this case, gamers didn't like. These gamers anyways. Bigotry also has a very emotional dimension to it. If you genuinely feel hatred for these people, then you're going to do hateful things towards them, and there's actually a bit of glee in that. The glee, in Billig's view, came from the idea that, by pushing the outgroup farther down and down and down and just treating them like trash, by depersonalizing them, by dehumanizing them, you also push yourself up, right? Your group is the good ones. You're the good guys. They're the bad guys. And it feels nice to be the good guys, but Actions have consequences, and this framing is inherently dishonest. So let's look at what motivated this. How did it get so bad? Well, part one, the word gamer became a social identity through a variety of things. Some of it was marketing, some of it was the imagined audience of gamers by marketers just because it'd been successful before. Some of it was the idea that geekdom in general is for men. Some of it was the idea that technology is for men. All of these things kind of coalesce to the idea that the prototypical gamer is a straight white man. However, especially as the internet became more popular and as media gatekeeping slowly decreased and became more democratized, people started to notice that a lot of other people were calling themselves gamers who didn't quite look like the prototypical gamer. To some people, this was fine. And remember, when I say gamers, I am not trying to say all gamers, Just think about the context of the sentences. I swear I'm not trying to say all people were like this. I'm talking about the subset of people who did specific behaviors. To some people, the diversifying of gaming and the diversifying of the people who played games and the realization that not all people who played games looked like them was seen as a threat to their identity and to their communities, which were based around a lot of common traits with each other. As time went on, and they wanted more and more to try to keep these communities around certain ideas and to try to maintain certain values around gaming, the border construction just got stricter and stricter. People on YouTube were talking about certain ideas and certain values that came synonymous with gaming. Part of the reason gamers have such a bad reputation is because of many of the values that were cultivated around them. By excluding women and excluding gay people and excluding certain ideas or excluding discussions of politics, they were just further trying to shrink the group so that they could keep that positive identity they had with the group. And in doing this, they also crafted a narrative that people who weren't part of the group were worse. They were the bad guys. They were the evil ones. They have to fight to protect gaming from the SJWs who are trying to destroy it. But of course, the SJWs never existed. The SJWs were a made-up category. No one even believed they were an SJW until afterwards, and people started saying it semi-ironically. So the ideology of hatred worked alongside the one that was focusing on defining a gamer as a very specific group. By pushing down the out-group and pushing up the in-group, people were able to make their self-esteem better. People felt like they were a part of something. The whole war thing is just like an extension of the idea that they're fighting for something. It's a sense of purpose. People like doing it. It's fun to be hateful if it's helping your self-esteem. Tadgefeld talks a lot about how there's a push and a pull of identities and groups, where if you know you have an identity and you hold it close to yourself, and that identity is changing, there's going to be some resistance, and people are going to start fighting over what it means to be that. And a lot of times, people at the margins can get kicked out, where if someone who is a leader, a metaphorical leader, just someone who a lot of people sort of assign the prototypical traits of the group to, if a person like that, say YouTubers or influencers, says, hey, these people are fake gamers, and the majority of people aren't like that person, if that person's at the margins, then they're going to say, okay, yeah, sure, we can draw the line there, so long as it means that we keep getting to be gamers. There could have been a reasonable conversation about what being a gamer meant, or what subdivisions of gamers you could have. I think being able to tell the difference between someone who plays I think it's reasonable for gamers to want to be able to know the difference between a casual gamer and a hardcore gamer, because those labels can be helpful. If you're talking to someone who's only played a couple video games versus someone who has played games for their entire life and plays a wide variety, I can understand the want to have different categories for those people. But the reality of it is that's just not how it worked in practice. That's not where the borders were being constructed. The borders were being constructed around whether or not the person was a man or a woman. They were being constructed around trying to prove that you were gamer enough. And in practice, that often meant just forcing an incredible amount of scrutiny among women to prove that they were gamer enough to actually fit in with the other gamers. What do you do about that? What do you do when your group's gotten this bad? How can you move forward from that? What does it mean to be a gamer anymore when it means nothing at all? So what do we do about it? Social identity theory is good at describing what happens, but it doesn't really have a solution. It doesn't really have a solution ready. And Billig was able to describe more stuff, but it doesn't really have a solution ready either. Well, I think the best thing we can do with a description is do like what a doctor would tell you to. Or I think therapy says this, the first thing you have to do is you have to identify the problem. So we need to be able to spot anytime people are crafting narratives around broad categories. Like anytime someone's saying just an insane amount of things about a certain category or a certain group, we should always be very suspicious of that, because a lot of times they're just straight up not true. We should also look at anyone who tends to react very negatively to people of like certain categories, just in general, right? Like stereotypes are useful and that's why we like to use them, but they're many times just not true, unfortunately. Like we don't have that kind of power. Life isn't that simple. People aren't that simple. Finally, remember that people aren't as different as others like to make them out to be. In this example, the Gamergators acted like SJWs and the Gamergators were in some sort of war. But the reality is a lot of the people they were mad at were also gamers. Anita Sarkeesian made an entire YouTube series about video games because she liked video games and she wanted to critique them. Zoe Quinn was a developer of a video game. All of this bigotry just ended up hurting the gamers themselves. Like, it took away a community that should have been had between two very different people. Zoe Quinn should not have been an enemy to gamers. Like, she is a gamer. By crafting this narrative, they just got people to believe that harassing these people was okay because they're fundamentally different, because they're really bad, because there's a war going on and you're either with us or you're against us. And there is no war and there is no us and them. The want to aggressively categorize people and the want to say that people who are not like you are like fundamentally bad in some way is just, it's the ideology of bigotry, right? That's literally how racism works, right? That's literally how nationalism works, is they say there are two types of people. There are people who are like us and there are people who are unlike us, and the people who are unlike us are very bad. When in reality, the people who are unlike us are actually quite a lot like us. At their best, we can use categories, we can use social identities to come together and to celebrate how we're similar to each other and to find community with people who we are similar to. And at its worst, we can use social identities to push people down and to stereotype people and to demean people. And I don't know about you guys, but I would much rather celebrate how similar we are and like how unique we are and what we all bring to the table than demean people. Maybe it's just me, but I think being nice to people is cool. So there's that.